All right, so now let's move on to chapter 3. Find chapter 3 here. And so this is process costing. We looked at job order costing. That involves items that are similar, but they are unique. And we want to be able to classify that particular or to determine how much that particular product costs so that we can sell it appropriately. Process costing is something where they're not that unique, okay? Like ice cream. Ice cream, granted that there are different ingredients for different types of ice cream, but to make the same type of ice cream, really there's no difference in allocating overhead compared to uh, the different types of ice creams. So really at that point, what we're going to do is just going to allocate all the overhead costs to that process. And you might have different steps in those processes, and each step may have different overhead. In the first example, again, we just allocated the overhead based on hours, some activity. And this, we're just going to allocate it based on volume, essentially. So let's get to the next one. All right, so a process manufacturer produces products that are indistinguishable from each other using a continuous production process, oil refinery. So one barrel of gasoline, the product cannot be distinguished from another barrel. Uh, Paper, chemicals, aluminum smelters, food processors. All right. So we are going to figure out, well, how do we allocate overhead to food processors? So comparing job order costing and process costing, process and job costs are similar in that each system records and summarizes products costs. We classify it into direct materials, direct labor, factory overhead. We allocate factory overhead costs to the products. Again, we have to allocate all those costs to the products. We use a perpetual inventory system for materials, work in process, and finished goods, and provides useful product cost information for decision making. So, in other words, we know how much something costs. They differ in several ways. And so, if you look at you can see the process costing and job order costing. Process costing, we have these direct materials for the ice cream, dairy, milk, and cream, sugar. Okay, and we go to the mixing department and we apply factory overhead here. And so all of this overhead gets allocated to this. And really, the amount of overhead that's allocated to each unit is a function of the total overhead and the number of units. Same thing here, work in process, the packaging department. And so packaging department has separate overhead, and we're going to apply all of that overhead. And really the overhead is going to be applied again based on how much packaging we did. We are going to have to allocate based on unfinished products. And what we're going to come up with is, say, an equivalent product. So an equivalent product means that we're going to make batches of ice cream. And so in making batches of ice cream, all of the materials are going to be used immediately. So if we're making 1,000 units of ice cream, we are going to have 1,000 units of, of direct materials because that's what we do first. We bring in the direct materials. And so if we have 1,000 units, no matter whether we complete them or not, each unit is going to have a cost, and that's dependent upon all of the costs involved. Whereas the direct labor and the overhead, we're going to do what's an equivalent. So let's say that we have 1,000 units that we completed, so they're all complete, so they get 1,000. But we have 1,000 units that, of course, have all of the materials because we've already started that, but we're only 70% finished. So each unit is going to be 0.7. So we take the original 1,000 units that we produced and finished, and we take 70% of the other 1,000 units, so that's 700. So we would take all the overhead costs related to, or the overhead costs, and we would divide it by 1,700 because that's the equivalent units. And then we would add that to the cost of the products. Of course, then we would take the 1,000 completed units out of work in process inventory and move that to the next stage. And along with that would be the material cost for 1,000 units and 1,000 units of overhead for that month. What you have left in work in process would be, again, 1,000 units with the full direct materials because we started with that. So we would have 1,000 direct material, whatever direct labor was used there. And then whatever overhead was used is going to be 700 times the overhead rate. So in work in process, we would have 1,000 units at the material cost plus the 70% or 700 units of overhead plus the direct labor cost. And then a job order costing, of course, it's depending upon the job order. So what we'll really be doing here is determining equivalent units and applying the overhead rate. All right. So here we have materials. They go into the mixing department, and the mixing department has its separate overhead. So we're going to apply that based on the number of units that go through here. Move them over to the packaging department. So we're going to take it from the mixing to the packaging, and then the packaging has its own overhead, and we're going to apply that based on the number of units that we complete for the packaging. So the cost of materials purchased is recording the materials account. Cost of direct materials is recording the work in process count for each department. Cost of direct labor used by mixing and packaging is recorded in the work in process accounts for each department. Cost of factory overhead incurred for indirect materials and other factory overhead is recorded in the factory overhead account, which again we're going to allocate. Factory overhead is applied to the work in process for each department. Cost of units completed is transferred to the packaging departments from the mixing department. Cost of units completed in the packaging department is transferred to the finished goods. I know that sounds a little complicated, so you really need to look at the book and kind of go through this. So cost of production, we want to determine the number of units to be assigned cost. That's going to be dependent upon the total units we've completed and the total units that aren't completed. Now, we would have had a beginning inventory. So at the beginning of the month, we're going to have work in process. And so those are going to be assigned costs based on their percentage of completion. And then we're going to add the cost to fully complete them. So again, we have these 70% completed. The cost for 70% has been added. And so this month, we've already got all the material costs because we used that already. We've got 70% of the other costs. And now we're going to finish. So we're going to have to add 30%. So those are going to be equivalent units. The 700 equivalent units are now going to be 1,000 equivalent units for the parts, but only 30% for the labor and the overhead because that's what we have remaining. So we're going to compute equivalent units of production. We're going to determine the cost per equivalent units, and then we're going to allocate it based on that. And you can use first in, first out, LIFO, etc. But we're going to look at FIFO because that really mirrors the actual physical flow of the materials. All right, so we started at the month. We had conversion cost 70% completed. So at the beginning of the month, we have in work in process 6,225. That represents all 5,000 gallons of direct materials, which is $1 per. And then we allocated $12.25 to conversion costs. So we start with $62.25. And so now we are going to add 60,000 units. And so the direct materials for 60,000 units is going to be 6,600. We're going to add the direct labor of 10,500, and we're going to add the factory overhead applied for 72.75. So we had 72.75 in overhead for that month, and we're going to allocate that based again on equivalent units. So the total production parts that we have to account for are 90,000. Beginning inventory, direct materials that we've added, direct labor, and then the allocated overhead. All right. So we have total gallons of 65,000 gallons. All right. But to determine, we have three groups. Group one is units in the beginning of working process. Okay. So that's really going to be, I'm thinking, 3,000 times or 30% times 5,000. We have units started and completed during July. So they started, they're done, they're out the door. And then we have units that we started but did not complete. So the total units to be assigned costs are 5,000 to begin. Started and completed in July is 57,000. So that means that we've transferred out of the packing department 62,000 gallons. And since we had 65,000 gallons that we worked on, that means that the ending inventory has to be the difference, or 3,000. Okay. So total count gallons to be assigned costs are 65,000 for the mixing department. So we have to compute the equivalent units. All right. Assume that a 1,000-gallon batch of ice cream is only 40% complete in the mixing process on May 31st. So that means that those equivalent units are going to be 400 gallons. It's just the percentage of completion times the number of gallons. Because the material costs are all added at the beginning of the process, the material costs are 100% complete. So we do have to separate that. So the material costs are 100% complete. And so for the equivalent units, the material costs are going to be more. The equivalent units for material costs are going to be more because that's all complete. Equivalent units for material and conversion costs are usually determined separately as shown earlier. Okay, so we've got material costs. The 5,000 units we started with already had the materials attached because, again, we start the process with the materials. And then we've got the difference, started and completed, would be the total completed less what we began with. And so transfer to per packing is 62,000, but the material equivalency is 57,000 because we already had accounted for the whole units or the units that we started with. So then we have inventory in process of 3,000. So the equivalent units are $60,000. So out of the material that we added this month, we're going to add them to these 60,000 units. So whatever materials that we drew out of our raw materials and transferred to work in process, we're going to divide that number by 60,000 to come and assign that to these batches. And then we're going to determine the conversion for the direct labor and the factory overhead. So each unit is going to have the full cost of the materials. And you can see here, though, that the cost of the conversion, we converted 70%. So the equivalent units is going to be, what did we have left to complete? Well, we had 30% of the job left. So 30% times 5,000 gives us the equivalent units of 1,500. We had 57,000 that we totally started and totally completed. So that's another 57,000 units. So that represents 58,500. And then we had 3,000 units that are fully assigned all the material costs, but we've only completed 25% of the process for this. So we're going to have 3,000 times 25%. And so that's going to be 750. And so we're going to have a total of 58.5 of these units. We're going to add the 25% completed units. And so we have equivalent units for conversion 59,250. And so we're going to take the total labor cost and total overhead and divide by that number. And then so each unit is going to get that in addition to the material cost. And that really is the main process of this. And you can see here, now you'll have to maybe scroll over, but the direct materials cost per equivalent unit is the total direct materials cost for the period divided by the total equivalent units of direct materials. In this case, because we're adding all the materials at first, that's going to be a full equivalent. But the conversion cost per equivalent unit is going to be the total conversion cost for the period divided by the total equivalent units of conversion, which we've determined to be 59,500. So we've got direct material cost of 66,000. We've got direct labor of 10,500. We've got factory overhead of 72,750. So this 17,750, we are going to divide by this equivalent units and assign that cost to each unit. So we've got 110, $1.10. So that's going to be 66,000 divided by 60 gallons. So we're going to attach 110 for materials to each unit. And then we've got the direct labor, factory overhead, and our equivalent units are 59 to 50. So we're going to add 30 cents per gallon. And so we are going to deduct for the full equivalents here of the ones that we started and finished, we're going to really add $1.40. So we're going to add $1.40 and then, sorry for these. Okay, so too many messages. All right, so that's really the basis of this, and this is what you have to determine for the cost. Okay, so we've got the original that we started with, and that's 66. Man, so many messages. Okay. All right, so we've got that many that we started with. We're just going to add the equivalent of 5,000 times 0.3 times 30 cents. And so they're finished. And then we've got 57,000 units that we're going to add $1.10 per gallon for the materials and 30 cents of conversion cost. So they're out the door for $1.40. And so what's left over is going to be, of course, $1.10 per 3,000 units that we still have remaining. And then 30 cents per gallon times those number of units. And so we are going to end up with total production cost of 90,000. We started with 62.25. We added the direct material cost. We added direct labor cost. We added the factory overhead, which we allocated based on the equivalent units. Okay. So for the beginning inventory, we started with 62.25. We had already added the material cost. We don't add that. But then we had 1,500 units. That's the equivalent times 0.3. So we're going to add 450. So the units that were originally in work in process are now going to be valued at 6,675. We divide by 5,000. That will give us a per unit cost. And then the conversion of the units that we started and completely finished will be the 57,000 times 110, or 62,700, and then 57,000 times 0.3, and that's going to be 17,100. So we're going to transfer out 79,800. And so that's going to be a total of 86,475. And really what's going to be left over is this 90,000 minus the 86,475. And so that's going to be our total cost. You can do it this way as well: 3,000 times 110 plus the equivalent of 750 times 0.3. So our new work in process inventory is going to be 3525. And so you really need to, I think, go through and reread this and get it in your mind. But basically, we're looking at, here's the production report, but the important part here is that you're going to assign cost direct materials. Really, if we're using that at the beginning, 1 for 1, and the labor and the overhead is going to be assigned based on equivalent units. And with that information, you should be able to do all of the calculations. You should be able to determine what is remaining in inventory, work in process inventory, and then what has to be transferred out. So you're going to be debiting materials, or debiting work in process materials, or crediting raw materials. You're going to be debiting work in process for the labor, and crediting labor payable, and you're going to be debiting work in process for factory overhead and crediting the factory overhead account. And then you'll determine how many units are completed, what those costs are, and then you're going to then debit finished goods, credit work in process, and that should bring you back down to the balance of 3364, I think it was. And of course, here's all your journal entries that we just talked about. All right, so this should get you started. Again, I would read the material yourself, but this should give you a pretty good overview of